Hi, and welcome to ARTalaap, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast with me, Kamayani. Today, I don't have a guest to interview. What I've realized over 15 episodes is that podcasting is a bit like dating. Sometimes your calls are returned, other times you're ghosted, and then there are days like this when it's just you talking to yourself. Okay, I'll let you dwell on that particular comparison. But anyway, moving on. I thought I'd talk today a little bit about my own research, like make a little audio documentary. So, have you guys heard of the Films Division? It's one of India's Sarkari film producing organizations. The Films Division, or FD, as it's affectionately known among makers and scholars of film, was originally established in 1947. That means around the time of independence, as the film unit of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. After independence, FT was the organization through which the Indian government made newsreels and documentaries showing citizens the development and progress that India was apparently on the path towards. So, yeah, pretty much state propaganda, but of great cultural and historical value, with a wide range of aesthetic sensibilities and political ideologies driving it. Over the past 75 years, FD has become an archive of not just some of India's greatest non-fiction cinema, but also India's vision, hopes, and dreams for itself, enabling some of the best-known filmmakers in the country to make documentaries, including people like V. Shantaram, Satyajit Ray, Hrithik Ghotak, and Manikol. Recently, FD has been in the news again for all the wrong reasons, as seems to be the norm in this regime. In December 2020, the Government of India decided to merge its film media units. This means that four major public funded institutions, the Films Division, the Directorate of Film Festivals, the National Film Archive of India, and the Children's Film Society of India, are to be closed down and subsumed under the umbrella organization of the National Film Development Corporation. And the reason cited for this fusing of institutions was, of course, an aim to optimize expenditure and resources. Uh, However, the entire process of restructuring government film units has been shrouded in mystery. The committee report that made these recommendations was not made public despite an RTI application, and stakeholders such as the employees of these institutions, members of the film industry, and India's tax paying citizens were not consulted. In December 2021, a letter signed by over 1,500 cinema workers, including directors, cinematographers, actors, editors, and screenwriters, as well as scholars and citizens, was sent to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The letter expressed concern about the lack of transparency regarding this move and the privatization of India's cinematic heritage. But as of right now, February 2022, plans to go through with this controversial decision are on track. So everything is on brand, really. So, with this current state of affairs in the backdrop, I thought it might be a good time to share with you guys some original research of mine, which draws on the Films Division archive. Before we continue, I'd like to let our listeners know how to access the material accompanying our conversation. To view the images and other material being referenced and discussed in the episode, click on the link in the show notes to access the guide. You can also find the link to the guide for each episode in our Instagram captions and tweets. I'll give you a bit of a background. So, in the 1960s and 1970s, FD went through a burst of experimentation that resulted in a small but historically important body of films which had a distinct language. One of the guys who emerged at FT during this period was a filmmaker called Pramod Pati. A few years ago, in 2015, which now seems like a different century, I wrote an academic essay about his practice. It was published in a peer reviewed journal called South Asian Film and Media, so you can look it up. It's titled Archaeology of an Experiment, the Science Fiction Cinema of Pramod Pati, and the complete citation is available in this episode's show notes. In this episode of ARTalaap, I'll share a part of that essay. I'll talk about the films of Pramod Pati and mix things up with audio clips from his short films. The framework and substance of this essay were developed with the help of work done by Vivian Shopchak, Gyan Prakash, Partho Chatterjee, Amrit Gangar, Shrirupa Roy, Anuja Jain, Shrikant Srinivasan, Sanjeet Narvekar, and Santosh Gaur. Just wanted to acknowledge their research ideas and contributions to my essay at the outset. Obviously, they're all cited in the full essay. I actually wrote it as part of an MA course that I did with my professor, Dr. Rashmi Sahni. So I'm excited to talk about this with you because I feel like more people will know about the wealth that lies in the films division. So my chief point is that the experimental shots that Pramod Pati made at FD during the late 1960s and early 1970s were a kind of prehistory of science fiction films in India. To make my case today, I'll share my analysis of three of his films, all of which are available on YouTube, by the way: Explorer, Claxplosion, and Trip, with respect to their use of sound, special effects, and non-linear narrative. Non-linear narrative means that they don't show the movement of time as cause and effect or from A to B. So, according to me, Pati's films represent a moment in the history of Indian experimental cinema in the 1960s when the use of science fictional tropes indicated a transforming media infrastructure. And this media infrastructure was being harnessed by the Indian government to construct a modern public sphere. I will say that looking at Pati's films, I'm less interested in whether or not they belong to the science fiction genre, but with the goal of using science fiction as a methodology to understand the relationship between the state, modernity, and cinema. Though you can't tell today, during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the Indian government was actively involved in modernizing India by way of its public sphere and media infrastructure, which included radio, television, and cinema. The experimental documentary emerged as a type of film in FD in the 1960s because the Indian state imagined cinema to be an art that could represent India's modernity through its very form. The main reason for FD's great experimentation with film form at this time was the appointment in 1965 of Jahangir Shapurji Jean Bhavnagri to the post of Chief Advisor, Films, in the INB Ministry. Bhavnagri urged filmmakers, including Pramod Pati, to be politically engaged and play around with techniques like the use of found footage and pixelation. Pramod Pati's films are super interesting to look at in this context because they play with space and time in ways that indicate the process of modernization in India while also revealing a skepticism with respect to the Indian state's ambitions. But first, I suppose you want to know who Pramod Pati was and what exactly he was doing in the films division in the 1960s. So if you go on YouTube, there's a video on FD's official channel, bless them, titled Oral History of Pramod Pati Part 3. And nobody knows where Part 1 and 2 are. It's all very enigmatic. But Part 3 is an interview with Bhima Shankar Shegde, one of the FD animators who worked under Pati.
जो भी कुछ थोड़ा सा मोमेंट मिल गया है बिकॉज मिस्टर पति हैज़ टेकन दैट इनिशिएटिव डॉक्यूमेंट्री फिल्म मूवमेंट के लिए एंड स्पेशली फॉर दैट एक्सपेरिमेंटल फिल्म का तो ही इज़ द पॉइनियर अकॉर्डिंग टू माई ओपिनियन ही हैज़ स्टार्टेड दैट मूवमेंट इन द फिल्म डिवीजन there was a very strong opposition for doing some experimental films. Huh?
Pramod Pati was born in 1932, joined the Odisha government as film officer at the age of 20, and like most overachievers in the post independence period, he received a government fellowship to study puppet animation at FAMU in Prague under Yuri Bradetska, Edward Hoffman, and Yuri Trinka. These are all legends in the field of puppet animation, and you guys should 100% check out their films. They are a trip, a sophisticated and artsy trip, but a trip nonetheless. I mean, if you happen to be smoking some substances while watching, the experience will be significantly improved. Anyway, but back to Pati. So, Pati was keen to bring this wacky Eastern European animation vocabulary to India when he started working at FD as head of the animation unit in 1959, introducing time lapse photography, pixelation, and stop motion. These novel techniques are visible in all his works and imparted to them the sort of uniqueness and to his practice, really, that characterized FD's experimental boom under Jean Bhavanagri. But rather than solely as expressions of an individual artistic vision, I think that Pati's films should be viewed as a response to the workings of a young, independent nation state producing a modern cinema in a modern media context. Let me explain. So, the media ecology created by the technologies of radio, TV, and cinema in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s allowed for the possibility of a disembodied access to sounds, images, places, etc., that these technologies obviously produced. For many Indians, the world was transforming. True to form, the ever enthusiastic Indian state staked immediate claim over all kinds of electronic waves that could transmit data to Indian citizens. For example, around the time of independence, All India Radio came under the supervision of the INB ministry, sanctioning an official or state governed public culture of sound. It was the same with television, though that took off slightly later in the 1970s. So, much like a codependent parent, what are those? Don't know what you mean. The Indian government was providing information and data to the optical and auditory arenas of the public sphere. Even with FD, the short films it produced were compulsorily shown before your standard commercial massy films, as Bollywooders call them, your standard commercial cinema, your movies, allowing the state to control citizens' sensorial experience. So I think that this extended mediascape of 1960s India significantly influenced the cinematic aesthetic of several FD films, and the peculiar science fictional characteristics as seen in Pati's films, for example, represent the state's efforts at creating an appropriately modern documentary and film culture. The science fictional tropes of Pati's films, drawing from changes in a mediascape largely controlled by the Indian government, suggest a cinematic form that rests on the negotiation between state ambition and artistic liberty. Given the sound design of FD films, in Pati's case, the extensive use of electronic sound, it's apparent that the aural sphere, the audio sphere, also was central to fashioning this technological modernity. As I mentioned in the case of All India Radio, the waves and signals of radio introduced electronic sounds into daily life, into daily Indian life. The state communicated its vision by transferring it through outer space. Coming back to Pramod Pati's films, S.D. Patil's sound design and Vijay Raghava Rao's music were really vital in creating an audio quality that infuses these films with the spirit of science fiction by suggesting alien presences lurking out of the frame and the coexistence of more than one time period in the same frame. So it feels a bit like through the film you're time traveling. While electronic music originated in the West, by the 1960s, classically trained Indian musicians like Vijay Raghava Rao were adapting it for Sarkari documentaries. And Pati, in particular, was a filmmaker who took the sound design of his experimental shorts very seriously. Here's his colleague Bhima Shankar Shengle talking about his interest in sound.
साउंड डिज़ाइनिंग का ऐसा सोचने वाला आदमी सब अभी कन्वेंशनल म्यूजिक, शास्त्रीय संगीत और ये ऐसा मिक्स करके कोई रूटीन टाइप ऑफ बैकग्राउंड म्यूजिक चालू होता था. लेकिन पति हैज़ डन एंटायरली चेंज एंटायरली साउंड पैटर्न ऑफ द फिल्म. उसका भी आप फिल्म एक्सप्लोरर देखेंगे तो वो जो साउंड ट्रैक है वो सब रिवर्स उसने ट्राई किया है. Nobody thought, even he has thought that time. And Vijay Raghava was the music director. वो तो एकदम कन्वेंशनल और शास्त्रीय संगीत का ये था, फैन था और वो वही बन जाती थी. लेकिन उसको भी कन्विंस करके वो उसने नहीं तो जनरली क्या होता है कि मैं म्यूजिक डायरेक्टर हूँ, मैं ऐसा नहीं कैसा डिस्टॉर्टेड म्यूजिक मैं नहीं लगाऊंगा. लेकिन ही कन्विंस और ही हैज शोन दैट इसका इफ़ेक्ट कितना है और साउंड का इम्पोर्टेंस. पति को जितना इम्पोर्टेंस साउंड के लिए उसने दिया है उसने किसी डायरेक्टर ने आज तक मैंने देखा नहीं. फिल्म के साथ विजुअल के साथ जो ये चाहिए आपका साउंड इज़ वेरी इम्पोर्टेंट. एवरी एस्पेक्ट इज इम्पोर्टेंट. कैमरा एंगल, स्क्रिप्ट, डिज़ाइनिंग, पैटर्न सब वही है उस, लेकिन ये अपना म्यूजिक के बारे में तो ही हैज़ एंटायरली चेंज दैट एक्सपेरिमेंट, डन द एक्सपेरिमेंट फॉर द हिज फिल्म्स. इवन फॉर रूटीन फिल्म्स ऑल्सो ही हैज़ ट्राइड सम एक्सपेरिमेंट फॉर द म्यूजिक. उसका म्यूजिक का जो सेंस बहुत पावरफुल था. वो डिज़ाइन म्यूजिक के साथ सोचना कि वो visual and music, it should go together. That thought has given Mr. Pati. नहीं तो बाकी क्या बोलते थे आज ये, हाँ हमारा फिल्म डॉक्यूमेंट्री हो गया है, म्यूजिक डायरेक्टर को बुलाओ, हाँ दिखाओ, और वो जो देगा तो लगाओ, एडिटर को बुलाओ, एडिटर लगाएगा बराबर. वो म्यूजिक डायरेक्टर बोलता है कि ये पीस इसके लिए किया है, ये पीस इसके लिए किया है, वो इधर इधर लगाओ. एडिटर का था, डायरेक्टर कभी कभी जाता भी नहीं था उधर, क्या लगा है क्या नहीं लगाया है वो. But he used to sit along with the editor. He used to sit along with the music director. क्या चाहिए. तो इतना इन्वॉल्वमेंट फिल्म में ऐसे आदमी मिलना बहुत मुश्किल है. एंड पति वॉज द ओनली पर्सन हु हैज स्पेंड हिज एंटायर लाइफ फॉर द फिल्म मेकिंग, एंड दैट टू डॉक्यूमेंट्री फिल्म्स.
So I'm going to speak a little bit about each of Pati's 3 films. Obviously, I won't go into all the arguments and details because that would be so boring that I wouldn't even want to listen to it. If you're hungry for more, you can go read the paper if you like. So I'll begin with Explorer, which was made and released in 1968. Now, this film is probably the best known film of Pati's oeuvre, probably even one of the more famous FD films of all time. This is because at one point in this film, the words fuck censorship emerged bright and bold, and apparently this holds great appeal for many Indians for some reason. It's not like we live in a repressive society or anything. Who knows? But back to Explorer. So the classic tradition versus modernity trope of Indian cinema is reworked in this film into a science fictional mode through the use of sounds associated with Western fantasy and science fiction, alongside those used in Indian mythologicals and religious ceremonies. So there's a clavioline, for example, an instrument that was used in an AT&T commercial in 1962 and therefore became associated with modernity, futurity, and a new sort of information society. This extremely specific knowledge about the clavioline came to me via Carlo Nardi's work. Just want to acknowledge him. To me, Explorer came off as a highbrow version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This plotline is manifested in the film entirely through the play of electronic sound and Indian music, both classical and popular Indian music. Let me give you an example. So, in this sequence of Explorer that you just heard, images of archaeological and religious artifacts and astrological drawings are intercut with extreme close ups of chanting priests. This sequence is set to a soundtrack that melds bhajans and damru rolls, somewhat expected given the milieu, with relentless electronic beeps that have zero connection to the priests that you're seeing on screen. The more you pay attention, the more it sounds like a progressive alien invasion of sound. Immediately after, you hear this sort of, after this sequence, after the sequence with the priests, you hear this sort of motif that accompanies, remember chamatkars or miracles in mythological serials like Ramayana and Mahabharata? That's when you knew shit was getting real. So this, you hear this, and then the soundtrack switches to electronica, and we see close-ups of interstellar debris or molecular formations. It's hard to say which, and maybe the point is the visual pun, and then a constellation of stars. And these stars are followed by a shehnai accompanying a close-up of swaying plants as though we are back to Earth from the electronic realm of outer space. As the film goes on, the sound changes to a musical patchwork of whirs and beeps, like a dial up internet connection. I'm really showing my age here, but yeah, that's the best example, parallel I can draw. And the imagery changes to institutional spaces like libraries and laboratories. The aliens have landed and infiltrated civilization. A tracking shot in a library is set to sound that alternates between a classical raga and a machinic sound effect. Soon, the classical vocals and instrumental music are phased out until we only hear various types of electronic sounds. It's like the aliens have completely taken over. The crackles, croaks, and otherworldly sounds eventually give way later in the film to an audio track in which classical and modern music, quote unquote, coexist. But you're left with this odd sense that the alien presence has assimilated itself into the known. It's a nod to the classic sci fi trope of the alien imposter entering human society incognito. What's even more eerie is that during the credit sequence of Explorer, all you hear is a series of electronic bleeps. It's so creepy, it's honestly like something out of the Twilight Zone. Moving on to Pati's next film, it's called Claxplosion. It was also made in 1968. This is a film about family planning in which Pati uses stop motion to narrate the story of a sculptor struggling to mold a ball of clay into a sculpture of a family until he realizes that the problem is the size of the family. So, super subtle stuff. Yeah, just amazing. Claxplosion opens in an empty studio with sounds of outer space and electronic effects. It's as though a non human presence is already in the space. It almost comes off as a creature film from the perspective of the creature. Now, coming to the sculptor protagonist, he is constructed as an unreliable, decentered character. The way in which his position with respect to the camera keeps changing, even as his project, the ball of clay, remains framed centrally. He almost invokes the character of the mad scientist, which is a staple of the science fiction genre. Dr. Frankenstein, the OG, of course, but also Doc Brown in Back to the Future. Some might say Tony Stark in the MCU. Some, not necessarily I would say that. As the film progresses, this Frankenstein trope intensifies as creator and creation come into conflict, each, resisting the other's attempts to control the narrative. Pati's Prague education, he spent time in the Czech Republic as a student, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, is audible in Claxplosion's sound design. This film sound design is very similar to works from the Czech Republic, such as Kybernetic Babička, which is a Jiří Trnka film from 1962. This film features an assortment of musical quotes from different eras with an electronic hum as the bass line that's similar to what we hear in Pati's films as well. Similarly, while there's no explicit mention, one could speculate that certain sequences in Pati's works were influenced by the Czech animator Jan Schwankmajer. Two of his films, for instance, Bit and Rakvikarna, feature similarly discontinuous images and a musical assemblage of mechanical everyday sounds. You can hear them here. I felt that the use of stop motion in Clay Explosion made it look like the ball of clay was like almost like a form of artificial intelligence changing on its own. And that's the sense you get watching the film. Like this is an animate, sentient being, even though it's visibly not. Since Clay Explosion was part of the Indian government's massive family planning promotional drive in this period, it seemed to be supporting the use of technology to intervene in a natural or divinely ordained process. And at the end of the film, when the sculptor wins out over the ball of clay, surprise, the sound changes from the alien electronic to recognizable Indian classical music. So, superficially, there seems to be a desire to blend the modern and traditional way of life. However, there's also the implication that the uncanny force operating in the studio when we first saw it has been tamed by human intelligence. The ball of clay was tamed by the sculptor. So, although Clay Explosion is a film on family planning funded by the Indian state, it could also be viewed as a critique of the government's fixation with controlling bodies, what has been called by people like Michel Foucault the biopolitical. Ultimately, the idea of controlling and indeed literally sculpting hum do, hamare do of the modern Indian family suggests a certain authoritarianism, no matter how well meaning, and the ominous dystopic slant of the film stays with you throughout. As a genre, science fiction has always been about exploring the dangers and possibilities of totalitarian societies, compliant bodies without a mind or critical thinking skills couldn't be us. The ambivalence in Clay Explosion, this ambivalence indicates a resistance to the Sarkari agenda. The final film I'll take up is much darker and weirder, if that's possible, based on what you heard. It's called Udan or Trip, and it was made in 1970. Udan almost captures the very transformation of oral and visual perception by changes in technology, the media infrastructure changing that I discussed earlier in the episode. This film also begins with electronic music. And just like with Clay Explosion, it conjures up a feeling of foreboding because of the arrival of a non human spectatorial presence before we, the human viewers, could get there. Udan is made up of 7 long short scenes. Each is a long take that's time lapsed through fast editing. Every one of the 7 scenes features an expanse of Bombay, like a railway station or a metropolitan road. Either it's busy urban heart or obviously suburban areas. And each scene begins and ends with a slow fade in and fade out. The reflective long shot slash long take combination conflicts with the blink of the fade in fade out that divides each of the chapters. There's this creepy sense that we're seeing this film from the POV of a non human optical structure that sees the world, our world, in exactly this way. Because of the high angle long shots, you also get a sense that the city is being watched in a form that's uh, really similar to the surveillance aesthetic of the CCTV camera. I mean, obviously, this is many years before those became ubiquitous. And the final shot is pretty scary. It's an aerial view of the gateway of India, decentered, before a menacing shadow spreads and swallows it as the screen fades to black. Yeah, that got me a little. Each scene in Udan has its own electronic score. It's a combination of beeps, machinic sputters, cybernetic, computerized squeals, and typical video game sounds, like that's what they put you in mind of, implying the presence of a non human voyeur at each location. The electronic nature of the sound gestures towards a system of signals being transmitted from elsewhere, from outer space, an unknown realm beyond the frame. Literally the frame of the film, but also metaphorically, like beyond the ambit of development and urbanization, which the state was obsessed with at this time. The final sound is a flat, monotonous buzz, much like an aeroplane taking off. Maybe the trip of the title, the Udan, was of a visiting extraterrestrial to an Earth city. The sinister disappearance of the gateway of India makes this Pati's spookiest film. A symbol of the nation state is erased by a force that is keeping watch as it orbits the Earth. So, big anti national agitprop energy. Uh, I think what really tickles many of us who work on the films division is how much of this subtly or maybe unsubtly even critical of the state work was being financed and produced by the Indian government. I think that's why it matters that these institutions remain autonomous and are properly funded and are accountable to the citizenry. The kind of move that the current government is pulling by being opaque about its maneuvers, it imperils, it endangers a publicly funded film heritage. So, but coming back to my essay, in summary, the spurt of experimental films being produced at the FD, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, is very much in dialogue with the transforming media landscape of those decades, governed as it was by the Indian state. And Pramod Pati's proto sci-fi films with their electronic soundtrack and idiosyncratic editing speak to the state controlled media infrastructure of the 1960s of radio and television. Both the state at that time and these films can be seen to have a futuristic ambition, both ideologically and formally, and are united through the mode of science fiction, redefining our relationship to time and space, and as an extension to modernity itself. Thank you for listening to my first solo episode in which I discuss Pramod Pati's films from the FD archive. It's been a bit awkward doing what feels like talking to myself, but I do hope that you tune in for our regular programming with guests. Thanks. If you enjoyed ARTalaap, please like and share the episode over social media. For more information and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at art.alaap and on Twitter at @RTALAAP.